In the last episode of Awkward Conversations.
The real goal here is to have lots of small conversations, as you had said earlier. So we often will I refer to it as 61-minute conversations, but it's really a lot more than 60.
Particularly when kids are in that preteen, teenage era, the last thing they want is, the parental caretaker, like, we're gonna sit down and have a serious conversation.
One thing that we can do as parents and as adults is to take a second or two to reflect on why we get anxious.
Building their self-worth, building their self-esteem, helping kind of connect and ground them to the people in their lives and the communities that surround them, and of course their family of origin.
Hey everyone, welcome to our episode today of Awkward Conversations. One of the things we keep saying is there is no perfect parenting. Just be present. Just be there. It's never going to be perfect. The way that works for one kid might not work for the next, and you have to do what's best for your kid, for your family, and for your situation. So don't drop being perfect and just be present, listen, and do your best. Just like you would tell your kids. Like you just said, sometimes I need to remind myself, like, oh yeah, if I were a kid, what would I want to hear? It's like, you don't have to be perfect. Just show up and try, and you're doing your best. And that's kind of where we have to start these conversations.
So something that I learned along the way from a trusted mentor is to introduce the idea of kind of oops and ouch moments in your house. And so being able to kind of, whether it comes to this talk or these series of talks we're talking about, or any kind of important talk with your family, introducing the idea that, you can, if you're about to say something that you're not really sure how it's going to kind of be received, you might say, this might be kind of an oops, but I want to say it, and then, invite kind of feedback. And alternatively, being able to come back if you feel like you didn't get it quite right and say, like, I feel like that was, kind of an ouch, or the other person can say, ouch, like that kind of didn't hit me the right way. But that way there's some language around that, and there's some invitation that, again, we might not get it right. And we then invite our children to also be able to respond in those ways too, as a way of communicating.
Amy, that is such a brilliant point. Sometimes what I found with my stepson or my granddaughters is sometimes what the best way to do is just acknowledge my failure, if you will, my humanity. And sometimes I don't know that we always do that, and because there's so much pressure to want to be the best version. But none of us, to your point, Jodie, none of us are really perfect all of the time, right? And sometimes if I can just have that acknowledgement of, yeah, boy, I don't think that went really well. Could we do a reset? Could we try this again? And maybe to your point, Aida, maybe it's a moment where we just take a break, and that's fine to have that moment.
And, I think also talking about that perfect parenting, it's yet another way for our kids to see that we're human too, and that it's okay to admit your mistakes. Like you were saying, like showing that example of our humanity, and, it allows our children to go, oh, I can try and make mistakes too, because, perfectionism and the pressure, particularly now that's on young people to get high grades, do all of the activities, play all of the sports, get into, the best school possible, because, all of these things that are pressures on kids, they feel them. And if your kids think that they can't make a mistake or they can't say something and then go back and try and fix it, that kind of perfectionism and pressure really can lead kids into substance use. So allowing them to see it's okay to make a mistake and go back and make it better. It's okay to say, oops, I screwed that up. It's just one more example for them of, I don't have to be perfect, and all of these pressures, I can take a deep breath and sort of let them out a little bit.
Sometimes situations might happen where we're really caught off guard, and we're not really sure what to say as parents, right? And we're not sure because we're concerned, and we're concerned because we love them and we care about them, right? So it's kind of like this circle that we all kind of have for us and within our families. And I think it's, as a parent, allowing ourselves more time. It's okay actually to give yourself a day and then come back and say to your kid, not to say anything at that moment when it happened, make a note of what's going on, and then come back the next day and say, look, can we talk about what happened yesterday?
I also like the idea sometimes of allowing the child to control that kind of part of the dialogue too, being able to say to them, like, I want to be able to talk about this again. When do you feel like you might be ready to? And so again, you're not saying like they have a choice to say we're never going to talk about it, but if it's appropriate and if it's safe, being able to kind of put them in the driver's seat to say, you tell me when we're going to talk about this. Is this an alternative option? And kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, not having all of the answers, and again, not needing to have all of the answers, like you said, Dr. Balsano, before. Information is constantly changing. I totally agree. Me and my team talk for hours a week about how should we, proceed with something, or, did we do this wrong, or, how do we get it right? And so, the pressure that parents must feel must be, 10 times that. But allowing your child to also help you find the solutions to these problems. So if you're not sure of an answer, inviting them to say, I'm not sure about that. Let's look into it together. Let's cast, Google like on our TV, or let's plan to, go to the doctor and ask them this question together. And let's kind of get, and vet information and sources as one. And I think that can also be used as a bonding opportunity to some extent as well.
So let's say we're in the conversation now. We have an opportunity, the door has been opened, and we have a moment that we want to start talking to our kids about substance use. What are some of the do's and don'ts when you are having these conversations to make it the most effective as possible?
Well, there's a couple of things that I can think of right off the top of my head, Jodie, that I think are important. One of them is not to lecture. It's so easy from the parental we're having this moment, there's something going on I'm worried about, you're hanging with some friends that I'm not particularly, keen on at this moment. And to get into the, did you know research says, and, all of this sort of lecturing mode, right? And I think all of that shuts the conversation down. The real goal is to keep the conversation going. In fact, to build it into a way that it's trusting enough that they will come to you to go, Mom, Dad, I saw this today, and what does that mean? And start to ask you the questions where possible.
And also, not stigmatizing. I know that's something that we've talked about. Not coming at it with a judgmental or stigmatizing or vilifying attitude, I think is really important. I'd love to hear more about that too.
I think that's an important topic as well. We bring into these conversations as adults our own assumptions and our own baggage that we have from however we grew up, whatever we heard along the way. And so we're inevitably bringing it into the conversation, which is why kind of telling ourselves to pause and to listen more is where we stand to benefit much more. So it's, letting children, youth speak in their own language to us about what's going on, and finding out from them actually what is their relationship to this particular topic. Is there stigma there? What kind of stigma? Like, how differently is your child thinking about something than you are? And then alone is a learning opportunity for the parent as well. I mean, I've seen that over and over, with my own child, where the more I listen, the more I find out that, oops, her generation is way ahead in terms of diversity, in terms of shutting down some of these boundaries, in terms of like addressing stigma head on. And, as an adult, I might not necessarily be so ready or open at this point. So that's what kind of being a little bit more quiet and listening, and really listening, allows the parent to learn. So stigma is huge. I'm seeing also with younger generations today, right? So middle school, we're talking about middle school and high school. Once they feel that we are in some way attacking or lecturing what for their generation seems like kind of a given show of diversity and acceptance, and they start arguing with us rather than having a conversation with us. And we then in return argue back, which is something, this is kind of like you don't really understand, or you don't realize as a parent that you're doing it until you're way in that argument with them, right? And then you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? And you're kind of trying to pedal back, right? I mean, we've all been there, right? But so in terms of stigma, really hearing them out, we might disagree with them, but that's not the point. The point is really to get a sense of where they are. And then in that conversation, starting from that point, from where they are, how they're looking at things, and then kind of moving from there and having conversation forward.
Yeah, it really allows us to strategize if we understand where they're coming from much better on how to kind of proceed. I also have talked about this in other episodes, but I think those open-ended questions are really, really important. They're kind of the antithesis or the opposite of kind of the lecturing piece. Another thing that comes to mind for me is being able to separate your child's behavior from kind of them as a person, and being able to ensure that, like, even if you're not happy about their decisions or the behaviors that they might be involved with, that doesn't mean that you still, that you are withholding love or that you don't care about them. And in fact, it's the opposite that is often true. and so we want to be able to emphasize that, I love you no matter what kind of we're talking about here that maybe feels like you're in trouble, or maybe you could have made a different decision overall. And also to be able to clarify with them, what are the words that we're saying and what do those mean to your child? So being able to kind of even ask, like, I just, shared this with you. Like, what did you hear me say? Because then we can kind of make sure that we're on the same page and that we're not kind of, in two separate books when it comes to the expectations that we're setting together.
Saving lives means staying informed. Knowing the dangers of using counterfeit prescription pills can help those you care about and keep our community safe. As a parent, educator, neighbor, or friend, we all play a role in building safe and healthy futures for ourselves and our loved ones. Do your part. Take the first step today. Visit GetSmartAboutDrugs.com to access education, prevention, and treatment resources. Counterfeit prescription pills laced with fentanyl are deadly. Be their protector. Be informed. Visit GetSmartAboutDrugs.com.
When we think about LGBTQ children, in particular those that are questioning and sort of the tone, I think every parent, I think fathers in particular sometimes, but it's true of all parenting, sometimes when you may have a difference of opinion on something and that starts to come through as a matter of your approach. But you think about children who are in a situation where we're using stigmatizing language. And some of those things really create situations that are quite deadly for some. Suicide amongst that community is quite high. Especially in school. They may be being harassed, intimidated, or bullied at school. And so all of that conversation and tone really matters in the end. And how we approach that and that language that we use really becomes really important in the end.
And I think also the idea of, not stigmatizing people who struggle with addiction, as someone who has been through that myself, I know one of the hardest things was, at first telling people, oh, I struggled with addiction, because automatically the stigma that they put upon you is, oh, well, you've made bad choices, you're a bad person, you're this, you're that. And I think really getting into talking with kids about, it's a disease. Your brain functions differently when you do it. And sometimes when you start these addictive behaviors, your brain all of a sudden changes and functions differently. And, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. These people that are struggling with this are not horrible people. They're not stupid. They shouldn't be pushed away or ostracized. In fact, they may need more love. And I think also for parents realizing that, the time that our kids are usually going through something like this and going through the worst, particularly with substance use, is usually when they need the most love. It's usually when they're in the most pain. And that's the thing, I know for myself as a young person, I was in a lot of pain. And substances were the thing that I naturally just went to sort of alleviate, numb, deal with all of that. And so, having those conversations so that your children feel open. So if at some point they do say, you know what, I think I have a problem. Maybe they're 25 or 30 when they say that. But it started at age 10 when you went, oh, these people need help. This is what's going on. This is addiction. This is what happens to your brain. And explaining it and talking to it is going to leave that door open in a way that maybe they'll come to you if a friend is struggling, because they don't think that you're going to be judgmental of that friend, or that you're going to think they're a bad person. These are all the things that kids hear. Kids hear what we say and how we say it. And those sorts of things can either open the door or leave it very firmly closed for kids to think that their parents will want to listen to what they have to say.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that in addition to some of the examples you mentioned, some of this also, how are you talking about television characters on the TV? How are you talking about people who you come across in your community who might be struggling with addiction? And how do you select language that really represents that they are having, a challenge, a medical challenge that absolutely deserves treatment, and not, being condemned.
To your point, Amy, I think sometimes there's a lot of shame associated. Both you and Jodie had sort of mentioned that as we talk about stigma, but that tone. And sometimes that shame leads to areas of more exaggerated use, or suicide attempts or deep depressions, that sometimes, culminate in very unfortunate situations. All of that in the end, I don't want to say it can be avoided, but the language choice and the way we approach it sort of matters in terms of, are we helpful or hurtful in the conversation? Are we helping a person seek care and treatment, or are we driving them to the streets? And I hate to put it quite that way, but sometimes in the end, somebody will choose to leave the house because they don't feel like they can be successful, or it feels, overbearing, if you will.
And not reacting in anger too, which I know is hard, as a parent, particularly if you are in a moment where, they came home and you went through their backpack and you found cannabis or you found pills, or in that moment as a parent, your head's exploding and you're like, that's it. Where are you? And I think learning to, take a moment and be like, okay, is me going into this conversation angry going to be able to serve any sort of communication or dialogue? Because particularly at that moment, you're in crisis mode, and anger is only going to serve to further drive that wedge in there, rather than coming from compassion and empathy and let's talk about this. Nobody really wants to talk when someone's yelling at them. You just kind of sit there and listen,
And especially if they're also intoxicated in that moment, of course, right? Like then, our gut instinct is to let's, discuss this right now, or, no one's going anywhere until we talk this out. And again, back to kind of the conversation about taking some space, the next day is probably the most ideal time to, reset that conversation. Another kind of do that comes to my mind for this conversation and this talk is to make sure that you end the conversation with kind of like a summary of what did we kind of talk about, but also like maybe a plan, or kind of, what are the next steps from here? Or what are the expectations from here? Because sometimes I think we have these conversations and we're like, yeah, now my child understands exactly what I was saying. Like we're on that same page. And then the next, day they're doing the same thing again. And they're like, wait, what do you mean? Like, I thought you said I had to do the dishes, but I didn't know meant I had to do the dishes like today, like
with soap, right?
Right, with soap and like hot water and all of these things. So
I've had many a dish washed in cold water in my house.
Coming up on the next episode of Awkward Conversations.
But you would be surprised. I mean, just how much misinformation is in their head, and they walk around. They walk around with such confidence of having that information, right?
I do know one of the things, though, as a parent, and that other parents I'm sure are going to deal with, is the question of, well, you have a glass of wine. Why can't I?
That sometimes putting it in the frame of why you do that is, in the end, it's about your health, wellness, and well-being. And anything that takes anything away from that, I think, is an important conversation.
Kids are going to make mistakes. And, just because you have the conversation once doesn't mean that it's stuck. And then if you now are having this, having this experience of like, oh, here we go again, reminding yourself that like, this is a process of your child learning.
Make sure to check out getsmartaboutdrugs.com. Parents, caregivers, you can find so many resources of great information there about how to talk to your kids and make these conversations a little less awkward. A huge thank you to the Elks DAP, which is the largest all-volunteer nationwide drug awareness program, and also a huge thanks to the DEA for their outreach program and for making this possible.
The views, information, or opinions expressed during the Awkward Conversation series are solely those of the individuals, speakers, commentators, experts, and/or hosts involved, and do not necessarily reflect nor represent those of the production, associates, or broadcaster, or any of its employees. Production is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the series available for viewing. The primary purpose of this series is to educate and inform. This series does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. This series is available for private, non-commercial use only. The production, broadcaster, or its channel cannot be held accountable for all or any views expressed during this program.